In this news roundup of the week, Russia invades Ukraine. We talk about why it happened, why the responses by the West will make zero difference to what happens next, and whether this is the first concrete shift towards a new world order, as some people believe. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. This week, we finally got the answer to the question of Putin's intentions, and war it is. In the instance of war, truth is the first casualty, and there have been claims and counterclaims flying in all directions, dodgy video clips on Twitter, you name it. Nevertheless, what seems to be verifiably the case is that Russian forces have been hitting multiple targets within Ukraine. The Ukrainian resistance has been spirited and in some places at least effective, at least temporarily, but ultimately the Ukrainians are massively outgunned. It seems likely that the aim is to push into the capital rapidly, take out the current government, and then to retreat, probably to some degree, having established some processes for installing a more compliant regime. There must be some serious regrets going on. In 1994, Ukraine inherited over 1,000 nuclear weapons following the collapse of the Soviet Union. They had possession of them, but not control. Nevertheless, they had plenty of reason to think that they might need serious power to discourage future threats from their neighbour. And there was no reason why they should not expect to continue being a nuclear power. They were persuaded instead by the US, the UK and by Russia that they should sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, get rid of the nukes, in return for a security guarantee from the signatories that their territorial integrity would be respected on existing borders. Putin waved that commitment away, saying that when the government changed to one that he didn't like, that effectively ended all agreements because he didn't recognise it as the legitimate government. When people talk about the value of a world order based on the rule of law, that right there is the alternative, and that's what's in front of us. So let's talk about why Putin is taking this action now. I've seen some interesting reflections on this, including some from Americans, convinced that it's all to do with them, and all to do with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And the answer is no, not really. Putin has written at length about how he sees Ukraine to be a fake country. Really, historically, it's a part of Russia and was only created in its current form by Lenin. But not only that, in recent years, Ukraine has increasingly been seen as a hostile country right on Russia's border. And not only hostile, he thinks, but hostile while also steadily increasing its defence capabilities and manoeuvring around joining what Putin sees as an enemy alliance, i.e. NATO. This was a status quo that Moscow considered to be unacceptable, and it seems that he concluded that the costs of inaction would be greater than the costs of action. At least it would be, depending on the likely scale of the response by the West. Having pushed and prodded and watched the West generally give a feeble response in return, at some point Putin concluded that he had little to lose. Russia is well placed to withstand Western sanctions for the time being. It has a healthy financial surplus with reserves at an all-time high, currently supported by the high international price of oil and gas. Also, its internal repression has removed realistic likelihood of serious internal protests, supported by its very active stream of relentless propaganda that has persuaded many Russians that Ukraine was shelling Russian-supporting rebels, and that the US and or NATO are to blame for the crisis. Now that could change if there are heavy Russian casualties over a longer time frame, and there have been some anti-war protests of a few hundreds in different cities. Nothing that is going to make a solid difference. And since the West is more dependent on Russian energy than they can easily accommodate, it isn't an unreasonable calculation that whatever the West does in response, in terms of sanctions, it won't be kept up for a long period because they can't. In any case, this is one of those areas where Putin feels that any pain would be worth it. He has a higher mission, and he simply doesn't care about the Western politicians frolicking around like galloping midgets, threatening their barrage of deeply painful sanctions. They won't dare fight Russia on the battlefield, that's Putin's presumption, because they won't take the risk of starting a major European war with a nuclear power. And since they don't dare to do that, they have no real power to stop him. And Putin took action now because, in addition to feeling that the weakness of the West gave a short-term opportunity, also Russia made public threats earlier and they failed. The spring 2021 build-up was arguably intended to deter NATO and the US from policies of defence cooperation with Ukraine and moving forward, albeit slowly, with Ukraine joining NATO. It came a month after Ukrainian President Zelensky closed down 3 television channels controlled by Putin's friend and ally Viktor Medvedchuk. And that was really the final straw from a period where Moscow had hoped they might be able to improve relations and reach a deal with Ukraine over Donbass. In May, Medvedchuk was placed under house arrest. In response, Putin focused on the situation at the subsequent meeting of the Russian Security Council, talking about how Ukraine was becoming an enemy, even labelling it as anti-Russia. Then there were other provocations, some from NATO. So 1 week after Putin and Biden had their first summit, the UK signed a naval arms loan agreement with Ukraine and the very next day sent its frigate, the HMS Defence, through Crimean territorial waters, an act that reportedly infuriated Russian officials. Russian warning shots were fired at the vessel and threats were made of a stronger response were such a thing to happen again. Also, Ukraine was cooperating with Turkey, striking a deal for TB2 drones. And in October last year, Ukraine carried out a first airstrike with such a drone on a D-30 howitzer in the Russian-occupied Donbas region. The drones might yet be one of the more effective weapons the Ukrainians have in the current situation. From Russia's point of view, the UK frigate and the drone strike were public embarrassments, a test of credibility. They may have been part of a context that made Putin decide to change tactics to become more aggressive. And this was when Putin started talking about all the historical imperatives, making radical and very specific demands of NATO while putting his troops into position. Yes, Putin has a broad agenda of objectives, pushing NATO back to 1997, which he's talked about, limits on the deployments of various missiles, no more expansion of NATO membership. But there was nothing in his list of objectives that required action right now, except for the issue of Ukraine. And particularly the idea that Ukraine would continue to improve its defences, and this would soon come to include long-range weapons capability that could reach deep into Russia. Indeed, Putin's biggest fear was missile systems that could reach Moscow in just a matter of minutes, something he's talked about explicitly. That sort of capability would mean Russia's ability to coerce Kiev with military threats would no longer be credible, so the action was either going to come now or never. Now, does that mean that Putin would necessarily aim to overrun Ukraine and absorb it by force into Russia? Foreign policy analysts tend to think not. The cost of occupation with a largely hostile population would be too high, but certainly constitutional and/or regime change would be seen as much more easily achievable. Rob Lee, a senior research fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, writing a couple of weeks before the invasion started, identified the most likely strategy given Putin's objectives. The most likely ground offensive option is that the Russian military would focus on destroying Ukrainian military units east of the Dnieper River, inflicting casualties, taking prisoners of war, destroying military equipment and degrading defence capabilities. This could include a planned withdrawal, a punitive raid, possibly after 1 or 2 weeks. It could also involve occupying terrain outside Kiev and threatening the capital unless Russia's demands are met. Such an operation would more closely resemble a more aggressive version of Russia's war in Georgia in 2008 than its annexation of Crimea. By inflicting heavy losses on the Ukrainian military, taking prisoners of war and degrading Kiev's defence capabilities, Russia could potentially alter Zelensky's incentive structure sufficiently to induce painful concessions. An additional benefit of such an operation is that it would likely be less costly and would not require Russian forces to enter cities, which would increase the risk of civilian casualties and make an insurgency more effective. He then considered a range of less drastic options Putin might consider, but concluded this: the problem with these more limited options is that they likely would not solve Russia's primary problem, a hostile Ukraine, which is increasing its conventional deterrence capabilities. So a more aggressive option is more likely. Good prediction, but whether they intend to force concessions from Zelensky or simply take him out is an open question, since it does seem, at the time of shooting this video, that Russian forces are pushing their way into Kiev itself. Rob Lee goes on to argue that the West has been poorly served by some of its policy advice in relation to all of this. Misinterpreting Russia's political goals and its most likely military options can lead to poor policy advice. Many arguments about deterring a Russian invasion assume Russia intends to occupy large parts of Ukrainian territory for long periods of time and suggest further deliveries of Javelin anti-guided missiles or Stinger man-pads, which could be effective as part of an insurgency. However, if Russia does not plan to occupy population centres, these weapons will have little impact and wouldn't be effective at deterring these Russian military options. It just underlines how much of a challenge comes down to Putin's ability to remain unreadable by the West and to always have an objective guiding his choices. And why we have an interest in actually understanding better the motivations who would tear down the existing world order based on that rule of law and respect for national identity and territorial integrity. Now, in a minute, we'll talk about what the West is actually doing in response. Politicians have been everywhere saying, "We stand with Ukraine," so you would expect some ironclad action would be going on, wouldn't you? But first, one of the most visible factors in how the world changes, yes, are the actions of leaders who decide to take risks with big gestures, as we've been seeing. But one of the others, and arguably even more powerful in recent times and at key points in history, is the power of informal networks. Such networks are often poorly documented because of their nature, doesn't make them any less significant or important. At a time when people have been asking in the Canadian Parliament, for instance, whether they should be alarmed at the links there to the World Economic Forum, with some believing that it has acted deliberately to infiltrate governments to further its own objectives, well, it's never been more relevant. Unless something major happens over the weekend which demands an instant response video, which, let's face it, could be a thing that happens, I will be looking at this question of these networks in a deep dive video to go live on Monday next week at 7 PM UK time. Want to know the truth about one of these major factors influencing how things are run? Well, join me for that. While Putin has been invading, the West has been trying its best to look strong while stating unambiguously that it won't actually get involved in fighting in Ukraine, because the alternative, going to war with a nuclear power, is something that they are not prepared to do. Putin has been very keen to encourage them to think extremely carefully about any such idea, more or less threatening the worst if they should. He said this just before the invasion took place: "As for military affairs, even after the dissolution of the USSR and losing a considerable part of its capabilities, today's Russia remains one of the most powerful nuclear states. Moreover, it has a certain advantage in several cutting-edge weapons. In this context, there should be no doubt for anyone that any potential aggressor will face defeat and ominous consequences should it directly attack our country." And the definition of directly attack our country almost certainly extends to joining Ukrainians on the battlefield in Ukraine. But we know that our leaders are fearlessly taking action because they said so, and because we are seeing pictures like this one of leaders looking concerned and serious on their phone, telling Ukrainian leader Zelensky, a man who probably expects to be dead soon, that they stand with Ukraine. which will be a great comfort, I expect. Of course, what they mean is that they're hitting Putin with sanctions. Various sanctions were announced by the US, the UK and the European Union countries, but ultimately they were all busy processing what would be the consequences of all of this for their own situations first and foremost. On everybody's mind is the price of energy. Biden said that he would aim to limit the pain the American people are feeling at the gas pump. The sanctions he announced were 1. Limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars and euros, pounds and yen to be part of the global economy. 2. Stop the ability to finance and grow the Russian military. 3. Impair their ability to compete in the high-tech 21st century economy. And 4. Sanction Russian banks that hold together around $1 trillion in assets. The devil is in the exact details as to whether any of that will trouble Putin more than it troubles the US itself. Biden also announced more American troops would be going to be stationed in NATO countries near to the action. Again, not to fight in Ukraine, but not taking it for granted that Putin's desire to turn back the clock on the Soviet Union might not lead him to invade current NATO members, should he feel he could get away with it. The NATO treaty is that an attack on one is considered to be an attack on all. Maybe the West has few options but to be weak in the face of Putin's action in Ukraine, but they want him to plainly understand where the line is getting drawn. Whether he believes them or not is another matter, but it's probably enough to keep the risk-reward balance weighed against going further, at least at this point. The UK announced a similar list. All major Russian banks will have their assets frozen and be excluded from the UK financial system, stopping major Russian companies from raising finance or borrowing money on the UK markets. Various similar measures. The EU is also promising a massive sanctions package, a phrase they've seemingly borrowed from the Boris Johnson hyperbole workbook. Germany already hit the button on the big one, as far as they're concerned, which is abandoning the commissioning of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This was something that Moscow definitely wanted to see brought into action, but, when it was announced, they pretty much shrugged it off. Clearly, there are not really many sanctions the West can conceive of that's considered serious enough to shake Russia from this particular course. And the ones that hurt the most, Putin believes will hurt the West just as much, if not more, and so they won't stay with it. That's what he's counting on. And it's hard to say that he doesn't have pretty good odds on that particular bet. A number of European countries, Germany, Italy amongst them, have resisted the move of banning Russia from the SWIFT international payments mechanism, a move that might genuinely make life difficult for the oligarchs and major government figures throughout the country. Why? Well, because they use that system to pay Russia for the energy that they still need. And that's the point. Even without sanctions, the impact of the conflict is likely to push energy prices to the degree where a global recession is likely. The invasion shook the financial markets and the consequences are likely to exacerbate high inflation supply chain bottlenecks. There are limits, therefore, to what the West is prepared to do. Now, in a minute, we'll talk about the potential bigger picture of all of this in terms of the global world order. A number of important forces are watching how these events unfold rather closely, and we should be clear-sighted about why. But first, Wednesday next week will be the first Wednesday of March, and that means it's time for the next live stream. I will be reflecting on the current events of the moment. Can't imagine what those might be, and answering your questions and comments from the live chat. It will be fast, it will be furious, and there's always interesting and occasionally eclectic questions to be discussed. So why not put it in the diary, 7 PM Wednesday next week, UK time, and join me for that. So what does this mean for the world order? The key question the Ukraine invasion raises, just days after I talked about Ray Dalio's book about the rise of a new world order, is this the start of a transition? At the end of the Cold War, with the collapse of the old Soviet Union, it was assumed that the liberal order had triumphed forever after. The peoples of the former Soviet countries were rejoicing at their freedom. It was assumed that the former Soviet Union would simply become integrated into the family of democratic and free nations. The end of history, as it was said. All nations respect each other's territorial integrity. Big kumbaya moment. And now that's under attack. The idea that the greater economic freedoms that come with capitalism would automatically produce greater political freedoms, that is now held into question. China, Russia, Iran, not only refusing to get on the freedom and democracy train, but increasingly confident in asserting that their train is the better train. Now the assumption that everyone would work together to make the world more prosperous and flexible with things like just-in-time supply chains for everything, including essentials such as food and medicines and energy, that has ended up looking incredibly vulnerable. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is significant in itself. The first time for many decades a major power has simply invaded another with a view to grabbing territory in some way or another. But it's even more significant because this is very much a dry run, the setting of a new precedent. The old world order, established after the Second World War and updated with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that had largely moved power politics into a framework of rules. Now Russia's looking to rebuild its former empire. China, meanwhile, is the real emergent superpower and first and foremost has its eyes on Taiwan. Xi Jinping has been at least as passionate about his desire to reunite Taiwan with the mainland as Putin has been about pulling Ukraine back into Russia. Ignore that at your peril. China has been watching carefully to see what the West dares to do in the face of this flagrant breakdown of the rules. Hedging their bets, not openly taking sides in a way that would give them real kickback before they're ready for it, but gently hinting that it's more NATO's fault than anybody else's. Indeed, in reassuring evidence that human incompetence is a universal, even in autocratic states, we got an accidental glimpse of the government's guidance through its state-controlled media. Tuesday this week, someone accidentally posted an internal memo directing its employees not to publish news reports negative to Russia or pro-West. It also encouraged them to filter and release proper comments. The post was swiftly deleted, but not before it had been noticed. So the Chinese are being measured and careful about this, weighing it up, and so they might. The point is that we had come to believe that destructive wars had become unthinkable between major economies. Indeed, Thomas Friedman once famously wrote that two countries with a McDonald's had not gone to war with each other. The theory being that this was because once you had a certain level of wealth, you had too much to lose to go into a conflict that you could otherwise avoid. Well, Russia and Ukraine, of course, both have McDonald's. So much for that theory. The apparent reality of that assumption rather masks the fact that the West did well by it. It was the dominance of the United States as the sole superpower, with mature medium-level powers in support of it, that helped that reality to hold sway and seem like a good thing. Major economies didn't fight, but that was mostly because it meant they didn't fight us, because they knew they would lose. Global politics has always been about power, nothing more, nothing less. And we may be reaching a point where the West becomes the one that doesn't dare to fight because the cost of losing would be too great. I mean, even if it's not true today that the West would expect to lose a fight, if it's lost its nerve, paralysed by the terrible cost that war would bring, then it amounts to the same thing. And the New World Order then, dominated by China with Russia in support, would be much more akin, potentially, to the brutal power logic of the past, where countries take what they can because they can, where the UN couldn't even pretend to be relevant any longer. The New World Order could become based on China's preferences, and the world would accept it because the world would have no choice. That's the vision of what's on offer here. Now, I've seen some Americans saying, we shouldn't get involved with Ukraine, it's got nothing to do with us, they don't have anything we need, I saw someone say. Well, not if you've already conceded your power and your status as a world superpower, sure. Are you quite sure you fully absorbed what are the string of consequences that flow from that? You think that if you retreat, presumably to fight your own civil war, symbolically or actually, that the emerging powers won't be taking full advantage of your self-destructive indulgence, your weakness. Think it couldn't happen? It's pretty much guaranteed. If you want to get a flash of a vision of how it begins, just look at the countries that have hedged their bets in relation to the current crisis. The ones that haven't immediately come out with a statement of support for Ukraine and the rule of law. This included most Southeast Asian countries, save for Singapore. India, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, South Africa. Now, a few have gone so far as to declare clearly the other way in favour of Russia. Belarus and Venezuela seem to be the main ones. But the world is now looking uneasily at the struggle. And they're doing that because they're very much aware that there is a declining power and a growing power, and it doesn't necessarily serve their interest to be taking a stand if they can avoid it. And that's one of the things that Ray Dalio, in his book about the New World Order that I talked about, predicted for the future. The old world power starts to find its allies deserting it in the face of a new global power reality. A process that the US could only accelerate by pretending that Russia's challenge to the world order of the rule of law in Ukraine is of no interest or consequence to its own interests. Something to think about. All right, no separate short thought this week. I think there's quite enough food for thought in all of that. My thanks as always go to the good people who make these videos possible by supporting this channel on Patreon. Without that support, it simply would not be possible. I aim to make videos that ask interesting questions, that try to provide some level of analysis that's not always present in other sources, and to follow the facts and the evidence wherever they lead. It's not as viral as playing to one side and telling them what they want to hear, but hopefully it serves an important role, particularly in momentous times. If you agree, and you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, though we live in interesting times, I trust that won't stop you from having a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.